Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's colloquium. This colloquium is with the Animals in Society Colloquium series that is co-sponsored between the Animals in Society section of the American Sociological Association and the Animals in Society Institute. My name is Carol Glasser. I help to organize this series, and I'm a sociology professor at Minnesota State University in Mankato. I'm a member of the Animals in Society section of the ASA. If you are a sociologist and you are a member of the ASA, you should be part of our group. But everybody should be a part of ASI, the American and Society Institute, as they have a much broader and further reach. So with that, I'm going to turn our introductions over to Ken. Ken Shapiro is going to tell you a little bit about ASI, and then he's going to introduce our speaker for today's wonderful event, which is why you all are actually here. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's colloquium. Before we jump into the program, I want to tell you a little bit about the series in case this is the first time you've been joining us. The colloquium series is the brainchild of Carol Glasser, and it's a joint project, as she mentioned, between the Animals in Society section of the American Sociological Association and the Animals in Society Institute. If you haven't joined either of those entities, please do so. For those of you not familiar with ASI, a couple of words about our programs. We've been around for about 40 years. The many programs and activities include two managed academic journals, Society and Animals and the Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science. We're also launching a journal for undergraduates called Sloth. We have a book series on human animal studies. We have a video series on keywords. We have a bunch of resources on our website. Please take a look at them. We also have a report that we put out monthly, Human Animal Studies Report. It's got a lot of resources on it. It's got syllabi and publications and announcements of events of interest to you folks. So we encourage everyone, non-academics or academics of any discipline, to sign up for the HAS report. Carol will be monitoring the chat. If you prefer to ask your questions that way, please do so. We will hold off all questions until after the talk. I'm delighted to meet and introduce Tim Flach. He's a photographer known for his stylized animal portraits. He has dedicated his career to documenting biodiversity and conveying empathy for our planet's endangered creatures. Flach has 6 main bodies of work, which is exhibited worldwide, including shows at museums of natural history from Paris to Beijing. He has 7 international award-winning books translated into multiple languages. His latest publication, Feline, is scheduled for release in the fall of 2025. Tim has an honorary doctorate from the University of the Arts, London at Norwich, and is an honorary fellow of the Royal Photographic Society. He is also a senior research fellow at Oxford University's Center for Eudaimonia. Wow, Eudaimonia, and Human Flourishing, and president of the Association of Photographers. He lives in London with his wife and son. So I think at this moment I will introduce him and have him take on the program. Tim.
Well, Ken, thank you for that. I hope you can all hear me clearly. It's a pleasure to have a chance to show you my work. I'm going to, before I lose, because I can't see you guys once I start presenting, so I thought I'd do a bit of swing round here. This is, you're actually in my studio, and this is my work here. You'll see a lot of pictures. These are all on a magnetic board, and it's how I put together the scale of the pages over there. For my feline book. My last books, I've been working with scientists and collaborating, and I think this is very important with areas like conservation. But what I'm going to do now is actually I'm going to share my screen and I hope I've got this all working. Right, you should see a panda there, I hope.
We do.
So my work is essentially about telling stories, and I actively have museum shows happening around the world. This is Germany, Austria. This is actually China, where in the last year I had 1 million visitors to my shows. I have current shows going on in Portugal, Spain, Korea. And so my interest is in essentially telling stories and also exploring how to evoke empathy through imagery, as it's been shown to lead to pro-environmental outcomes. But I'm going to share not only some of the images behind my new book, which haven't really been seen publicly, and some of the challenges that we face in the sense of the erosion of trust of images because of generative AI. A lot of my projects involve working with school children. This is Colombia, where I'm projecting as part of the Conference on the Illegal Wildlife Trade. My work has been probably seen by many of you, but you won't know I'm behind it. I've done some commercial work, and for example, the first images of the iPhone I was behind, and I've been behind a number of different images. These are some of my book covers, and I'm going to show you some behind scenes of my working. So my last book came out in 2021, and it was on birds. And this is a set doing flamingos, obviously. I'm just going to run through some of these. These are gento penguins. So quite a lot of my work also looks at questions around almost the human aspect. So these are Jacobean pigeons, one of the earliest domesticated pigeons. They have these almost hood-like, quite almost like fashionistas. This is my studio just behind the wall here, and I've done a lot of projects. In fact, I've done work with Scientific America where we've actually explored birds' sort of questions around consciousness of ravens, corvids, and whether they can recognize themselves in a mirror. And we set it up using this very same set. But what I want to do is create personality and character, relatability in my images. So like, you know, the character from Angry Birds here, Northern Cardinal, or actually creating something that actually, in a sense, re-engages us because it makes it more personal. Apparently, if you have this Inca, you have a larger moustache, it usually means that you've got more fish and thereby you're a bit more attractive to the other potential partner. A lot of my interest is not just about anthropomorphism, that is sort of the creating likes of human characteristics, but it's actually often about making things relatable. What's interesting here is that because our predictions tend to be that eyes are above feet, when presented with these bats, we find that we can entertain them the wrong way up and that we don't try and turn them the other way up, although I'm presenting them to you upside down. A lot of my work looks at symbolism, like the pigeon, the feral pigeon, no different genetically really to the dove here. That's a symbol of purity, the Holy Spirit, and how it can dramatically change when the color changes. Some of these are ambiguous pictures. So in the arts, we're very intrigued about almost the disambiguation of an image, how something almost becomes rewarding because you either can't discern what it is or you're trying to unmuddle what you can't quite predict. So here, for example, this horse looks like it could be going to a boxing ring, but it's actually a head protector after having anesthetic. Also, you get this kind of slippage where a picture evokes an idea of something like a mountain, but it's clearly still a horse. Like Mies van der Rohe's comment, less is more. Or you have an image here where you're kind of, sorry, bear with me, I realize I've got to clip something, I don't know if it's a problem, that you're looking at something and the eyes are almost like they've been modeled, they almost seem unreal. And you're left in this rather ambiguous space of a smile, you're not sure if it's alive or dead. Or in the case of this shot here, it's almost like this halter horse, which is a sort of show horse, is sitting in a painting, but the painting's actually the stable window in Ajman. And it also mirrors a painting by George Stubbs. So I often have these almost layered interpretations, multiple layers or ambiguity, where it has potentially different meanings. For example, here you're left wondering, what is the circumstance? In fact, this is a naturally occurring mutation, but the stance almost brings you to questions around how do we relate to chickens today, given that they are a mark of the Anthropocene. There are trillions of chickens bones out there, and how actually it's almost like this gazes uncannily back at you, almost like a plump ballerina. But at the time, I think it was Tim Colson said he did something where he did a project said, why should conservationists heed Pokemon? And he presented to British school children from a selection of 100 cards of both Pokemon characters and British wildlife, and found that they were more likely to identify with the Pokemon characters than the cards with the British wildlife on. So it is quite disconcerting, this whole relationship and understanding the natural world. Or for example, with these bonobos, how if we interpret that very much as a human, we might see this as a tender moment. But these are actually bonobos, and this is probably a female dominant gesture over another younger female. And so it's the way in which we obviously project our anthropocentrism upon the animals. For example, this could look like extreme cosmetic surgery. This is the Yunnan snub-nosed monkey. It has this unusual adapted nose because it has to live at some of the highest altitude and coldest climates of any primate. Or how, for example, the capuchin looks like it's texting. It's a very anthropomorphic. But I think more interesting is we look at this animal. For those who are not zoologists, they probably wouldn't know what this species is. It's a pied tamarin. But what I find intriguing is the idea that we may not recognize the actual animal, but if we said Yoda, then there might be much better recognition that this is a science fiction character than the actual animal that might be slipping into oblivion. And I think this whole relationship between our relationship to the natural world and the virtual world is obviously a disconcerting one as we approach a new era, really, of AI and generative AI, where we don't know if something is real, or certainly the challenges of whether it's a deep fake or synthetic. So this picture I took in captivity of the Spix macaw, which was a bird that time was extinct in the wild from the 1980s. And as part of a group who went over to reintroduce it into Catina in Brazil. And on the day we presented it, they also projected it on Christ the Redeemer. So this is a still from a film called Blue, which ironically may have helped support conservation by bringing awareness of an endangered blue parrot. And actually, on the day we released the bird, the first bird in human history to be reintroduced successfully, they projected it on Christ the Redeemer. I think it's fascinating to see where virtue and actuality slip. And I worry that obviously we've got great challenges ahead of us as we are going to find it harder and harder to discern if something ever existed. This is a shafarka named after the sound that it actually makes, shafarka. And obviously it's a very anthropomorphic pose, one of sort of like almost a school child at an assembly. I think when it comes to areas like cuteness, it's something that I'm exploring. I'll show my new book where we're looking at neuro mapping and how cuteness operates on the audible cortex, and how that area accesses empathy levels at very, very fast rates. But this guy's interesting because he can also grow back part of his limbs and his brain. And of course, neoteny is the capacity to choose when to become adult. I think it's a fascinating creature, and it goes on. The saiga that looks like it's from again, a Star Wars canteen. The saiga is an antelope. that's critically endangered. So a lot of my work looks at how do you make animals personal? How do you make it relatable? How do you bridge that sense of otherness to sameness? But in the case of these sort of more traditional landscapes, sometimes what's interesting is pictures that puncture our consciousness. I use Roland Barthes' terms of punctum, which is this idea of something that touches us, that moves us to a point. Sometimes you need to feel you can relate to the personality and the character, and that by doing this, it makes it more relatable. And later on, I'll show some images that were to change the course of wars because they were relatable. The red-crowned cranes almost became extinct. There are quite a few now. There are about 2,000 in Japan. They would have been across most of Asia. They were highly symbolic, a symbol of long life, fertility. They're very symbolic throughout Asian art, but it's incredible to know that that doesn't afford them protection. There were less at one point in the 60s than are in this very picture. Also, how certain images we relate to, like here the vultures, the icons of death, but of course nature's cleaners. I'm also very interested in how we use biofluorescence as a kind of language of Mother Nature. This is southern Japan. These are fireflies that flash, or how these become almost like cupids. These are sea angels, which are quite small, and how they become almost angelic, and how these symbols cross over. Now, an area I'm fascinated in, and I wanted to explore, is the tools I use to make my images more empathetic, to make them more engaging. And left gaze bias is something I've been fascinated in. This picture shows a Hungarian pulley, and I would imagine, I know you can't speak, that you would see this as fairly symmetrical. But when I present it to you like this, reversed, the symmetry seems to evaporate. It seems to be slightly wobbly. And this is because of left gaze bias. In other words, we go up this side of the picture. The head's around here, by the way. So I'll give you a moment to look at this picture. So this picture actually has a window on the top right-hand corner. It was done at Washington, D.C., at the National Zoo there in Washington, D.C. And it's actually was set up, I think, when Nixon was gifted some pandas. They, in preparation, created this den. But it's interesting that most of you won't have seen the window at first glance until I pointed it out. And that's got to do with the tendency of left gaze bias to go to one side of a picture. In the same way, this picture I did on a misty morning of a dog jumping through the bracken, you'll probably find it harder to find this. So to move to this, it affects everything we do, design, graphics. This thermo sort of mapping shows the intensity of the eye to go to the camera left and predominantly look to a human face to one side. But what's interesting is dogs do it to humans, but they don't do it to other dogs. So, for example, here we have a graph here that shows actually that with respect to adults, we look on the grey graph predominantly 75% first fixation point. And this, I'd argue, affects the way that we look at imagery. Dogs do the same thing, predominantly to one side, as opposed to the white, which is the right left-hand gaze. But what's interesting is the next graph shows the human face upside down, where dogs have to work out how to read their owners when they're being tickled or whatever. So going back to that, that's really, so I use this in my work. So this is natural light, and I retake the picture to make the eye move from camera left to right. I use that dynamic to make my pictures more emotive. So when you look more to one side of a picture, i.e. the left-hand side, it becomes more emotively charged. There are many different tools. Here, for example, a lowland gorilla I took in Gabon from a boat. I've added an extra bit of water here. and it pulls you up to the camera left eye, making it more emotionally charged. So the corn sweet illusion, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is a very real thing for me as an image maker. For example, these two areas of grey, which I'm sure you're familiar with, are actually the same, except for the last sort of gradation approaching the last 25% here. So this Minecraft illustration, I think, shows it so well by Dale Purvis, is that these two areas, top and bottom, are the same, but what we now have is predictive processing playing in, where we predict light is from above, and that we assume that there's more light on the top, thereby the illusion gives that the cube at the top is now, this has been enhanced, this illusion, is darker, when of course it isn't darker. So it's possible for artists like me to use lights and darks in a way that I don't have to make something appear light, and I can make something appear light and darker without it actually being lighter or darker, by understanding how to use edges. So I wanted to touch on something else here. Nick Ute's shot from the Napan, with Napan during the Vietnam War, was to obviously have a profound effect in the States and around the world, was the relatability of the child here. The way that Brett Sturton's picture is relatable, almost like a Christ-like figure of these mountain gorillas that had been killed. The same way that Chris Jordan's picture here of albatrosses and atolls, this is thousands of miles away from human habitation. They've been feeding their young with plastics and effectively dying. He's laid them out in this way, but it's the fact that that relatable detail could be found in your fridge when you open it. And it's not always about anthropomorphism, the human characteristics that we project on something. It can sometimes be about relatability, about bridging our world. The plastics that we find around us that now are causing the death of young albatrosses in the atoll 2,000 miles away from any human habitation. In the same way, this shot by Nilofer was to profoundly change our own Prime Minister, Cameron at the time, Merkel and the Canadian Prime Minister, to let more people come in from Syria. Now the detail is the little Velcro shoes, not the one that was the other shot where the dead child was in the surf. I think it was a 3-year-old dead child. This is on the Turkish border, Turkish coast, sorry. That it's the punctum, it's the puncturing of our consciousness because of a small detail that's relatable. Now, I want to get to my current book, which is on cats, and it's something that I've collaborated with two eminent scientists, Jonathan Losos and Morten Krittelbach, who's a neuroscientist here at Oxford. And this cover, this is just, we're literally in the middle of putting this cover together to send it off tomorrow. But I wanted to show that because I'm worried about the future of the images being, in a sense, the language of imagery of animals or anything, starting to change so fast that we don't trust what we're looking at. So I've made QR codes with behind scenes footage, but I've also extended it to things like solicitation purr. That's where a cat embeds a higher frequency, if you're not familiar, at about 400 to 500 hertz, that is equivalent of a human, the pitch of a human baby crying, and it touches the same auditory cortex area, the empathy area at the front of our brain. But here's the behind scenes. So this is taken in my studio. This is my above floor. And this is from below. It's a bit ambiguous, but this is probably a better example. So this cat has, this is in Paris. So this is actually, I think, reasonable enough that one would question if it's real. And because of that, the importance of future-proofing against the erosion of trust of images is, I think, incredibly important on a book like mine. I have to think in 10 years' time, what will it, how will people read these images? This is an extraordinary, we're not quite sure if it's a mosaic or a chimera cat. I think I've called it genetic puzzle in my book. And it's got millions of followers. It's quite a young cat that we photographed about 6 months ago. This is in Japan. It's a Persian, it's a British short hair. I actually had a drawing like that, so it's not far off. um, and I'm looking at it's essentially Kawaii culture from Shinto through, and how that operates. And that image was to illustrate that, like a sumo wrestler. Here's the from underneath my studio again. It's a chinchilla. I wanted to show the genetic of the black paws against the white. Now, I think this, in my book, you're some of the first to see this because I'm just showing some different pictures. This is the Siamese in the 1960s, and today the show Siamese has got much bigger ears, very different, in the sense that we've been shaping show cats. I believe in the 1950s, before clay litter came in to revolutionize things, there were only 6 breeds recognized by the main governing body, the GCCF. Today, that's 43 breeds, or 48, I think. So there's been a 750% increase in breeds of cats. So we suddenly started shaping them. Compared to dogs, there's been hardly any change. This is my cat, which I've taken from day 8, and I've continued to photograph, and it's going to be to scale in my book, and to look with Morton Crittlebark, who's a neuroscientist, on the concepts of how cuteness works. So to take this further, I actually had my own brain scanned, although I gave myself a chin lift because I'm afraid it's not very pretty. And my plan is to put the response areas, you see the order cortex, the fusional facial area, which is the bit that's quite interesting about left gaze bias, is that there's a biasness in facial recognition to one side. All adult faces tend to stimulate this area, the blue one. And then infant faces, that can be human babies, or human, dogs, cats, they get a response in the area at the front here, the oral cortex, which is so fast that you form emotions before conscious thought. And my plan is to reshoot my cat here in a couple of months before the final deadline to illustrate these kind of concepts. The wheels are amazing. The cats are this sphinx here. So this is an area I want to look at superstition. I've covered everything from the Egyptians, from first civilization, through to the superstition. Here, the tapetum lucidium, the glowing carpet, or the crystals on the back of the eye, and how they push light back through. But I used it also to explore the whole idea of witchcraft, superstition through the Middle Ages, and also to talk about the actual, you might say, the anatomy of the cat, where you see the rids as it develops the eye. And it's almost, I think we call this, it's almost like a globe. I had obviously challenges to decide, that I should use a toy and talk about the natural behaviors of cats, domestic cats, fundamentally still hunters. The Criollan bobtail becomes very human, almost like it's pom-pom, like it's this is a cat known as a Lurkoi, which is like a wolf cat, a fairly relatively new breed from the 1980s. And the arm will be produced the same size as a human arm in my book. This cat has hypertrichosis, which in cats is very rare. Even in humans it is, but it's rarer in cats. From Canada. And this is part of my talking conservation part. I'm looking at habitat. This is the Pantanal in Brazil, and it's really just to explore the wildcat species and their predicament, many of them obviously under threat. There are some I think are fascinating. This has one of the densest furs, even by warmest coats, the Pallas cat, often known as a rather grumpy looking cat. I don't think he looks grumpy here. About the size of a domestic cat, but a lot of coat. This is some of the studio shots I've done. And that's finally the crested macaque, which is really about, the whole thing about relating. I haven't really spoken so much about aspects of evoking empathy through a sense of vulnerability, relatability, but the idea of us kind of thinking about their character and personality. I'm going to unshare so I can actually see everybody. I hope I can see you now. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to take any calls. I mean, any questions.
Thank you so much. If anybody has questions, they can use the hand raising thing, and I'll see you at the top and call on you, or you could pop your questions into the chat, and I will monitor that and read those. Thank you so much, Tim, for that wonderful presentation. We have our first question. Are you ready, Tim?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So the first question is from Shannon. How do you navigate the ethics of captivity, especially when working with wild animals who are held captive against their will?
I think that's a very very interesting question, a very important one. In fact, it's one that it's not specifically, but it's related to the whole question around us reshaping animals, particularly with the cats. I think that the obviously, I'm sure many of you are aware of the kind of scale of livestock we have here. I think someone said that I'm going off track, but I want to come back because it doesn't make much sense without a context. So the mammalian body mass of our livestock, us and our pets, are 96% or something. That is terrestrial animals, and only 4% is wild. So I'm not here to form the contentiousness. I know there's a lot of debate about big cats being kept in captivity. I must put it in perspective. There is mass captivity of animals and cruelty of like pigs and so on. I think when it comes to dealing with animals, obviously a lot of what I do is if I do anything commercial with animals, we have a vet on set that actually manages and monitors and sees that everything, whatever animal that is, whether it's a cat or a dog, so that no one is, that there's a proper documentation to show that there was no stress. I obviously, with many of my animals, and you can probably see from the way I photograph them, if I was putting any pressure unnecessarily on the animals, I wouldn't probably achieve the kind of shots I do. With respect to the ultimate question, the ethic problem is a huge one. A lot of the animals I'm working with, if they are in a studio and they're a wild animal, they're usually captively bred over several generations. I'm sure you're aware that CITES came in the 1970s, meaning the restriction, even today, an animal that is can't even be imported under CITES into the UK unless it's actually an animal that's now literally, I think only through zoos can they do it, unless it's already effectively captively bred in the UK. So we have, very strict, which is so hugely different to the 1960s, where I was actually looking at something with G. Mill crossing the Bengal cat, to create the Bengal cat, where in the 1960s, they just imported wild Asian leopard cats with no restrictions. I'm sorry, that probably doesn't answer it because it's a huge discussion, really.
We have a couple, thank you for that answer. And I have the feeling there'll be a couple more questions on that before the end of today. But we got a couple questions about the left gaze principle. So I'll try to sort of put them together. And the question is this principle the same for everyone? So some questions came up about whether it has to do with if you're left-handed or right-handed, or your cultural experience in terms of how you learn to write, if you learn to write left to right or up and down, or is it just innate to our biology?
So it's innate to our biology, and that's what makes it so fascinating. So effectively, obviously, the written word is relatively a recent thing for people who could actually read, and in terms of our development. It is interesting that actually a lot of old world primates also tend to exhibit the same left gaze bias as well. It is essentially because the right hemisphere is predominant, I believe, in facial recognition. And when infants are showing at 6 months inanimate objects, human faces, they have the tendency to have left gaze bias literally at as infants, they have left gaze bias across almost everything. And as we get older, that tends to be placed towards more human portraits, and animal portraits. But having said that, if you look at the design around you, the objects, the clothes, everything, you'll know a tendency for the composition and structure of things to be biased towards that. Because we find when we rest on one side of a picture and we keep them there for longer, it becomes more emotionally charged. So you have to look at all the great masters, the architects, the designs, your clothes, everything around you is influenced by that tendency. I believe when I spoke to Morten Quittelbach, who's a neuroscientist, about this, he really said that it was because essentially the facial area on the right is more dominant slightly than the left, is the belief on that. And going back to writing, I don't think there's any correlation. If you look at Hokusai, I appreciate he was a Western influenced artist. I can cite other people. You'll see that they use the same left gaze entry in the bottom left-hand corner for compositional purposes.
Thank you. Melissa has a question, and a lot of people have showed support for this. So I'll ask this one next. How can we move from evoking empathy to changes in behavior?
So pro-environmental outcomes, essentially, or things that will actually... I think that one of the great challenges is trying to make things personal and relatable. And that's why I gave the examples of Nick Utshot, because I was trying to show things that actually would change the course of wars or migration. Principally, it has to be something that comes into our world. So one of the great problems of the environmental movement is they invested in romanticizing the natural world. And they didn't realize actually the paper that I did with Cameron Whitley and Linda Kaloff, which looked at empathy, was interesting enough. When they're seeing pictures that are more anthropomorphic, it makes people uneasy, but it actually raises much higher levels of empathy. And where people were viewing pictures and asked to give their feedback, where the pictures were just wildlife images of these endangered animals, the same endangered animals, there were actually no less levels of empathy than those who see no images at all. So these are contradictory, and in one way, this goes back to the contradictions between not necessarily making people feel good. And I believe the environmental movement, in a sense, have failed to recognize those fundamental aspects of the human condition. If that puts in a few questions, I'm sure there are going to be some questions about that one.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question on empathy. I noticed that on animals we know less well, you are photographing them in maybe positions that might be peculiar, but they themselves don't look peculiar for their species. But when you're focusing on the cats, you're focusing on these animals some of the images were animals who did look peculiar for a cat or a little bit different. Do you make conscious decisions? Because to evoke empathy, you're representing individual animals more often than animals as a group, right? So I wonder how you make the decisions per species on how to evoke the empathy.
Yes, I mean, although I said evoke empathy obviously applies to some of the portraits, but the cat book is obviously, I'm showing you a preview of some of the images that make up the book. And sometimes I'm also telling the stories around the different allelic changes that have led to these new breeds, because we basically hijack evolution into our homes and, in a sense, decide how to shape them. And then the question is, are we shaping them in a sense for looks or over health? And so there's a lot of obviously questions around brachycephalic breeds, which means like if you're not familiar with the nose, so particularly with some of the dog breeds, particularly where they can't breathe as much. And there's even questions around the fact that some of these breeds become attractive because we like the vulnerability of our animal. And so there's certainly mad contradictions like that. So with the cats, I'm also in mid-flow. I'm trying to tell the story not just of how we're shaping the cats, because if dogs, for example, 80% of dogs are pedigree, 20% are mutts. Cats are far more than 80% are moggies. So you've got a very different dynamic happening. So what I tried to do is question what that relationship is, why we're so attached to our companion animals and how that works. And I want to dismantle it both on the neuroscience to show and illustrate how cuteness works, but also to explore the whole questions about how when we have an allelic change naturally occurring, a curly cat, a naked cat, or nearly naked cat to be precise, how in a sense people wanted to be godlike. They wanted to have these foundation breeds. And I think the craziness is a reflection of who we are. I was a social critic called Lippitt, Mikhail Lippitt, said, modernity could be described as the disappearance of wildlife in humanity's habitat and its reappearance of reflections of itself, which I think is reflected in those, when I show the film and how the film was reflecting with the Spix McCaw, how reality and fiction were mixing, and how the craziness of the Tamarin that very few people know, that's been concreted out to extinction in the Amazon, how we know it almost as Yoda, but we don't know the animal. And I think that there is a sad kind of lack of, how can I say, this connection which I talked about when I talked about Tim Coulson's work on why conservation heed Pokemon, is this disconnect with nature. The fact we're not, it's so worrying. And I'm very much involved at the moment trying to get my government not to take our copyright and everything. At the moment, we've got all this going on. I'm involved in that. And the whole question about that whole thing about generative AI potentially eroding our trust in what's out there, I feel could only exasperate this disconnection further.
We actually have a question about AI in here. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. The question is, reads, AI not only has a place in animal imagery, but in animal legal and welfare policymaking. Have you experienced any ethical challenges or lessons with AI that can be used with other animal issues for consideration?
I'm not sure exactly the context of that, because obviously, are we saying that the AI, or generative AI to be more precise, is rendering images that are confusing because we don't know whether they're real and they relate to the ethics of the animals? I'm not quite sure. What's your interpretation of that?
Ken Hopkins, if you want to unmute, you can clarify your question. Okay, I'm not sure. I don't.
It says in animal legal welfare policy. I'm not saying, I don't know how qualified I am as a photographer to be able to answer that. I certainly think that we're entering a challenging period, I fear, as I'm someone who's very obsessed with predictive processing and how we conjure reality with a limited amount of sensory data and build our predictions, our inferences on that, our best guesses, how many aspects of our relationship, both to the natural world and to what we conceive as reality for our survival success, will be eroded. But that is a personal, concern I have.
And Ken, you raised your hand. Sorry, Ken Hopkins and then Ken Shapiro. I think you have a question that relates, so we'll go to you next. Ken, we can't hear you if you're talking. Okay, so we'll go to you, Ken Shapiro. You're muted too, yeah.
Okay, you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is somewhat different, but maybe it's related to the AI issue. So it seems like the sort of one of the premises of your project is to try to enhance through photography people's empathy with animals, and that presumably would help in which the ways in which we treat animals. So the empathy increases identification. It increases relatedness, connectedness. I agree with all of that. It also seems to be premised on the notion that sameness, that we empathize as the animals become more like us. And that raises the question of course, of anthropocentrism. So I'm just on the other side, the realistic photography, less empathic inducing. But my question is, do you want to use the notion of otherness rather than empathy? We're interested in biodiversity and enhancing biodiversity. Biodiversity is based on the notion that we respect differences in other entities. You may be familiar with Levinas's work.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you want to simply go with the AI and the virtual reality as it increases empathy, or do you want to also go with, or instead go with realism as a way of showing how different some of these creatures are from us, and that would, according to Levinas, enhance respect and therefore increase.
So I think you touched on a very important point. So we're really talking about the arguments against anthropomorphism historically have been about denying animality, and that touches on what you're saying, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think that the problem we've got is the research paper that Cameron Whitley did with Linda Kaloff and myself showed that we have a great challenge here. We have to, in a sense, engage and create and grab attention. Then we should take the discussion to the environmental issue. And so you're using it as a way of making it relative. So I showed you Nick Ute's shot and the shot from the Syrian crisis that was to change for all the horrendous pictures from Syria and from Vietnam. Why do certain pictures change that? It's because they bridge that otherness. So my question to you is, I suspect that you need to grab attention with one type of photography, educate with another. So we're talking about it as a process. What I do quite extensively is I spend all the time doing the stories to go with the pictures. And that is then to, in a sense, take and thread and make people care and think about the circumstances. But I agree with you that it's not about denying animality, it's trying to start people on the road to actually connect with the story.
Okay, very good. I like that response. I just want one comeback, if I may.
Of course.
We have been focusing more and more in science and human animal studies on invertebrates. And invertebrates, it's a tough call to get us to empathize with them. We're attracted by their otherness, their differentness, and their strangeness. And again, can that produce respect for them?
I think this is great because we call them the small majority. It's the fact that ecologically, I don't know, 25% will be of species are beetles. So it's something I'm very familiar with, that chance, and trying to, in a sense, use the tools. And I think we are trying to look at that, how to make them relatable. The problem, obviously, many projects have around the world is these ambassador species are the ones that, if you're building say the Iberian lynx, I don't know if you're familiar with the project, but it was almost extinct. The rarest cat became almost extinct, and then I think there was some dam project, and then the local government could connect to the idea of saving a cat rather than a beetle, and then one hopes you preserve the habitat that then supports that.
Yeah.
It is a problem, but I think the point is that to actually explore the very mechanisms, as you say, may make the invertebrates sexier. Who knows? We do need to tell the story. And I did, in my book Endangered, feature quite a few insects to try to tell those stories. So it's not like I just do big cats, but of course, pandas are more relatable, and that's sad because you're actually right. I mean, I wanted to do something on soil biota, and soil biota, the megafauna are your worms, and then you've got these springtails and other things. So small guys, less than 2 millimeters long, soft body, most of them. It's really hard, and it's kind of, but you're right. That's the challenge. Make the invisible visible.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And since we're talking about your work on different species right now, we have two questions about specific species with people wondering if you've ever photographed rodents like wild rats and mice to evoke compassion and teach people about their role in the ecosystem, and a question about whether you've ever done work with cows.
Cows. I did something, yes. The cows, I did something looking at what they call modern muscling. So I found it bizarre that there was an economic way in which we structured the livestock simply to give you a bigger rump steak or whatever. So I looked at that in one of my projects called More Than Human. In terms of mice and rats, I can't say I've done a great deal on that subject. Not that I haven't done, I think I did something on the GFP protein, which is obviously used in cellular research. But certainly with livestock, I did look at the way that we had historically reshaped livestock for economic interests.
And what about rodents and mice?
Not a lot on rodents and mice. Not that I never photographed them. The thing is, I have my books and other projects. I have photographed them, and obviously, I'm very aware that what are vermin to us are things that adapt well and are successful as a species. Usually, cause us the most problems, like cockroaches. I've done cockroaches before, a number on cockroaches.
Thank you. Ken wrote a bit of a clarification on the AI question. I guess his mic is not working. I think what Ken is saying is that AI has created legal and policy information that is hard to determine that AI created it, and wondering if there are examples of how that's dealt with once it's recognized with imagery. So
Yeah,
AI
so
creates.
what you're talking about is transparency and labeling. So I think that I don't know how your policy in the States is going to happen, but the UK are really, I think what will come up forward is that you can have a kind of like an NFT, you can register an image when you photograph it and actually give it a unique data to prove its provenance. But the real challenge for us is as the online material is being polluted or contaminated with images that look so real but never existed, synthetics and deep fakes. I think that the government, I hope, will bring legislation in that will essentially make it a requirement to give evidence of whether it is, of labeling. I know that a number of organizations like for film work are now saying you can register with us and show evidence you fulfill our criteria, then we'll give you a certificate to prove that this documentary was real. And I think labeling and transparency is more related to, so I'm one of the most great photographers apparently in the world. I'm on the Midjourney list that came up in the court case with a number of thousands of other artists. So you can literally take my work and ask it to do Midjourney an image in my style and it will spit it out. We're in crazy times at the moment.
Thank you so much for that. We are almost out of time. We only have a few minutes. I do want to give you a chance if there's anything you feel like you haven't said that you want to say before we close out today, Tim.
Well, I don't think in the sense that because it's hard for me to predict what your respective members are interested in. So I think it's probably better I answer a few more questions if I can.
Okay, I'll take at least one more question, just in case some of you are getting out the door right at 12 for a meeting or something. I did post our next colloquium next month, which is going to be Cameron Whitley, who has been discussed by Tim in this. So you might be really interested in that. It's going to be considerations in talking about animals with disabilities, and the flyer is in the chat. Okay, so we have a question. Do you think photographing other primates is or should be somehow different than non-primates because they're so similar with us? Or is there something you think one should keep in mind when photographing primates? Does it, for example, matter that people can easily interpret the gestures incorrectly, as with the hugging bonobo photo?
Well, I think clearly gosh, you've got two different concepts there, and it goes back to perceptual Umsvelt's concept of perceptual bubbles. This idea of, obviously flat faces, our closest relative, obviously they generally are given much more ethical considerations because they're like us. But then you have animals that have different sensibilities. A homing pigeon might have a GPS system that's beyond our comprehension. I think we tend to ethically consider affording animals more thought when they're when they are more, their intelligence is more mirroring our type of intelligence. And I think that that's not to say, of course, primates should be given absolute, how can I say, consideration ethically, but I think sometimes if an animal doesn't mirror our type of intelligence, we don't afford it necessarily the considerations that we should sometimes.
Thank you. We have a quick question that you could answer quickly. Do you anticipate doing more work on animals with bioluminescence?
Not at the current project. I go from one to the other. I think my next project might be on cuteness, working with neuroscientists at Oxford and looking at also the implications of mental health. Because when you look at something that's cute, you actually think faster. It stimulates certain parts of your neurohighway. So that would be one project I'll be doing. I believe I might be involved. We don't know quite. It's going through the process of a film that might link into our connection with animals. I'm also would like to explore further conservation communication and thereby explore how I put exhibitions going forward about that as well. So I've got a number of hats to wear.
That's wonderful. I'm sure that everyone here is going to follow your work. I think a lot of us probably already were following your work, but we certainly will now. We are right at the hour, so I would like to thank you so much, Tim, for this wonderful talk, getting us thinking and sharing these fabulous images with us and giving us a sneak peek of your upcoming book. When is that going to be out? Do you know?
I've been given the 9th of October this year. I
All
don't know
right,
if
so
we're
just
quite
in
on
time for our
schedule.
Christmas list, right?
I can show you a picture of the cover because we've been mocking it up in the studio.
And that was the one we used on our flyer, so thank you for letting us use that.
So it hasn't been seen by many.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's here. This is recorded. Everyone who registered, if you have friends who registered but couldn't make the time, we'll get an email when the recording is ready. I will send it out so that I know a lot of you teach. I'm sure you'd like to use this video in your classes to get your students talking and to share with your colleagues for all the great work you're working on. I hope that we see you all next month. If any of you are out there doing great work that you would like us to consider for this colloquium series, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat. And with that, I wish everybody a good day and thank you so much. I know we're spread out across time zones, so I was so happy we could make this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Ken. And thank you. Goodbye.